Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Indeed, it is showtime, and that explosion was just the Toronto Maple Leafs heading off into the summer. So I don't want to talk about it, all right? I just don't want to talk about it. That's all there is to it. Welcome in. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast, and it is the 15th day of May, heading for Queen Victoria's weekend. And, long weekend and much overdue in this part of the world. Looking forward to it. The weather's changing, and so good opportunity to get outside, enjoy the outdoors, enjoy time with family or away from family, depending on your posture on that. But anyhow, welcome in. Lots to talk about today on the podcast. And, we welcome in Keith Leslie. He is a Queen's Park commentator from CHTV. John Wright is our founding veteran pollster. Tim Hudak is here, partner at Council Public Affairs and former leader of the Ontario PC Party. And Kathleen Wynne sends her regrets. She's got a grandchild that needs her attention more than she needs us. So that's how it's going to go today. So we hope everybody's well at that house. That's just one of those things, Tim, and it's been a while since I've been in that case, but my kids are in that place where all of a sudden the whole day gets blown up because somebody has an upset stomach first thing in the morning and the daycare crisis kicks in. I mean, you guys must have gone through that.
Yeah, for sure. We're kind of getting through most of that now, though. Miller, who wants to be an ECE, she's heading off to Seneca in September.
Wow.
Super excited and proud, going to be in residence, be great. But she's co-oping as an ECE for the experience. So she's getting exposed to a lot of germs. So she's, I guess everybody in that system is going to build up their immunity over time. She's starting it out. But, thank God for grandparents, right? To have that ability to have the kid taken care of in a loving home and that treasured time. One of the things, if I could change, I wish I had more time with my grandparents.
Yeah.
Miller's going to college.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
I know.
Jeez, holy cow.
Yeah, it's super sweet. And she's motivated by helping kids, particularly kids with special needs. She's a very, very compassionate young lady. Yeah. I've got no idea where she gets it from, but she is very compassionate. She's going to do great.
Yeah, well, good luck for her, and
that's great.
whole new journey and adventure on that. And so I do want to get to it's budget day as we record this. We kind of fussed and farted around thinking, should we wait and talk about it afterwards? I'm pretty sure we know what the main themes are going to be, what the messages are going to be, what's going to be in there. So we'll leave some surprise after the fact. And as we say, depending on when you listen to this, things may change. So that's just the warning off the top. But you were at the park last night, Keith, really enjoying yourself while, the Leaf fans in this part of the world were just ready to slit their wrists and kind of go fade off. But you were at the parks for the Spring Fling. Tell us about it.
Well, the annual Spring Fling is off the record, so I can't tell you about it. It's which is, I must say, I'm really glad that the status of this event, it's an annual event where the politicians get together with the media and all the media handlers and communication staff and everyone else. A lot of the lobbyists show up as well. And everyone insults everyone on stage with a little video and a speech. As I say, they're off the record. The one in Ottawa, the annual, it's become an on-the-record event, which has made it more stilted and stuff. This one, aside from a lot of F-bombs, which I'm not breaking anything by breaking any rules by disclosing that, they were really entertaining. It's quite fun, and people get, it's a real enjoyable evening and a lot of fun. I wondered why they didn't have the Leafs game up on the big screens after the speeches were done. Now I know. I realized when we got to the subway station. But no, it's a terrific event. The politicians, really let their hair down for a little bit. The press gallery takes it on the chin some, and so do the politicians. They give it out to each other. So it's a very entertaining night. But as I say, it's off the record, so I can't tell you any of the jokes, some of which were really, really pointed and harsh. But it's a great thing to go to. And it's just good for politicians of all stripes and the people that cover them and the people that work for them to have an event where they're just, standing around laughing, having a couple of drinks and, a few fast food or finger food type things. So it's a really good social event, one of the big ones on the year for the Queen's Park calendar.
I gather you ran into a few listeners without breaking any embargoes.
Absolutely. It was amazing. As I was introduced, some of the, my era, the older reporters would introduce me to younger reporters or younger communication staff. And then, On the Ledge. We listen to that. Like, I never said On the Ledge. They do the title. They can write in. They listen all the time. Several of the politicians came over to me and said, hey, we're listening to that. You're on our must listen list for the podcast for On the Ledge. So it was very gratifying to hear that they really do listen to what we're talking about on this show. And it was very gratifying to hear that.
All right, so don't fuck it up now. We got to know. You know what, though? When I hear that, John, it harkens back to some of the stories that, you've told when, there were evening sittings and there was more collegiality at the park. And there wasn't, and to be fair, I think probably Queen's Park is not the extreme case that we have seen in other legislative assemblies where there's been real divisions. But there's still been that kind of political stripe has taken over, as opposed to it feeling like, as Keith describes, more a sense of community and collegiality. We could use a little bit more of that from time to time.
Yeah, I do recall it very well. As a parliamentary intern at the legislature, I used to sit in the gallery at nighttime with hardly anybody there. I actually found it to be a really interesting time where you could see the politicians interact. I remember Deputy Premier Bob Welch, for instance, who was also, if I recall correctly at the time, was treasurer. We'd go and sit over with Robert Nixon, who was the leader of that at that time of the Liberal Party. You saw, cabinet ministers coming in a little inebriated, I will say, wearing their tuxedos. Frank Dre, I remember crawling around on the floor. But you know what? It was a different era, and it was a different mood at nighttime when you could. It was a different glow. It was just a very social time where people were sitting in the opposition benches. They were quietly talking with each other. I think when the Harris government came in, their intentions were good to try and change the dynamic of the days that you would spend there. And I think, Tim, you might correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was, doing away with the night sittings, but actually going to Fridays, I think was the option that they had there. But I think, when that happened, it changed the dynamic of the legislature. The Harris era, of course, was a little more
elbows up.
Yeah, a little more on that side. The common sense revolution came in with a bit of a bang, and certainly there was a reaction to that. But it changed the dynamic of the House. Those two sword lengths apart from the benches really make a difference when you can actually walk across knowing that those swords are down as opposed to straight up. So I noticed a difference, and then I kind of put it down to that there wasn't this kind of social interaction. It was more of a partisan interaction after that.
Well, I dare say on the podcast, Tim, we've kind of alleviated some of that, sword length issues, because both you and Kathleen sat across the aisle from each other. But I might be stretching it here, but I think you like each other, so I think it works in this environment.
Even though she sued me, I
know. I remember that. Yeah.
Badge of honor. That's all settled. It's all good. Yeah, what's interesting, I think of all, there's not even I think, there's no doubt that of all the leaders of the parties that I work with, it would be Kathleen Wynne that I get along with the best, even though they're probably the most fundamentally apart on the issues. We got along really well on an interpersonal level. She's very, very genuine. We actually cut our teeth together, sort of climbing the ladder in our parties. She got a couple rides in my truck heading off to do, shows like The Agenda and such, or CP24. I'm going to say that maybe the four of us will combine someday. Some of the real veterans argue that the turn from the collegiality to the more sharp partisan nature of the debate took place when the cameras came into the legislature. Right? So stuff that John Wright talked about happening behind the scenes, there was less of that, more playing for the camera. Certainly, Jim Bradley, who had the second longest tenure, I think, in the history of the entire legislature, could tell you a tale about that. I'm gonna be on the positive side, though. Dave, I despite Keith had mentioned all those watching On the Ledge. So secret here, it's a bit like pro wrestling, right? You can put on no chairs, no jumping off the turnbuckle, but you can have the battle in front of the cameras and go out for beer or coffee afterward. And that was proven true to me. Like I always, I could be as sharp a combatant as anybody, but try to keep the doors open. And in my post-politics career at OREA, now at Council of Public Affairs, I find that members of all parties can actually get along quite well. Dalton McGuinty was the first member that actually crossed around the floor to shake my hand when I was first elected in 1995. And I, in turn, did that with, new members that came in subsequently when I was opposition leader. I was at the OLIP intern reception, and a couple of new Democrats came up to me and said, thanks for the early advice that I gave them. Like, there's actually a lot more that happens behind the scenes. So despite the show, despite the bell ringing, it's actually pretty good.
Well, if I could, Dave, just one little point that also changed, the cameras and the Harris government. Many MPPs told me the ending of the traveling committees led to a much more partisan legislature, because again, you'd be in Kenora or Thunder Bay or something. You've done your days of hearings. You're going out for dinner. Who are you going out with? Well, the people you're traveling with, the other committee members from all the parties. And those were lost when the traveling committee stopped. I think a lot of that done, the night sittings and the traveling committees were done to try and get more women to be able to have a career in politics, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, the night sittings were really terrible for women trying to get into the game. And even the traveling committees, you're away from home so much. And if you've got, a young family, it's brutal.
Yeah, well, okay. Go ahead.
A couple of quick ones on that. Like, he makes a great point of the traveling committees, because that did bond you, right? You would do your committee work, but then you'd go out for dinner or have a beer, whatever. I remember Peter Cormos, who, legendary New Democrat fighter for the people. He was my neighboring riding. And I remember Peter and I actually seeing who could last longer on a one of those artificial bulls, mechanical bulls, up at a bar in Timmins.
There were no cell phone cameras, though, right?
No cameras in those days. And then I remember one time the night sittings, because you could bring in, the only thing you bring in is a glass of water, and the pages would bring it into you and that kind of stuff. But we did the midnight sittings; the pages weren't really there. And I remember one of our members, Ted Chudley from Milton, brought in a glass of water. And then when he poured it, it started fizzing over, because it was I think gin and tonic and not water in that glass, those midnight sittings.
Yeah, that Gilby's mineral water.
That doesn't look quite right, Ted. That doesn't look like the water I got.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to sort of point that out, because we get into this conversation quite often around our politicians, politics, et cetera, and where we're talking so much nationally about the need for unity. Again, back to your analogy to the wrestling show, Tim, last week we had comments from Premier Ford saying, I just texted Danielle. We do get along, by the way. There's that just kind of drawing the curtain back. So for those of you who were at the Spring Fling this week, and you don't have to raise your hand or anything, but if you haven't already done so, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel or follow us on whatever podcast app you listen on, Apple, Spotify, iHeart, etc. So good of you to be here. So thanks for that. All right. Mentioned off the top, it is budget day, and we're going to run through a few of the things that are likely to come up. Tim, I want to start with housing, and big announcement at the beginning of the week. The minister, Rob Flack, telling us it's going to be faster, farther, higher, greater, speedier, whatever it's going to be. All of the labels that we have all the answers now to make sure we hit our targets.
It takes too long, and it costs too much to build a home in this province. I think we all know this. We need to change or create the conditions to get home builders building again, doing what they do best. And that's what this legislation is going to do. There's some key components to change how fast it takes to get a building permit and how much it costs to build a home. So we're trying to, again, create the environment. It's bold, it's ambitious, it's aggressive. We're working closely with our municipal partners and home builders, and we're going to get the job done. Again, creating the environment for good success to take place in the next 12 to 24 months.
So what do you say, Tim? I mean, we've heard this speech before, to be fair. I mean, we've heard the talk, we've seen the news releases, we've had the ribbon cuttings, whatever it might be, even these symbolic shovels in the ground, but you know better than anybody, we have not come close to hitting those targets.
And, one reason for that was when interest rates went up so quickly, right? And so many hikes that the financing dried up and people weren't buying. So builders slowed down naturally. However, more importantly, to your point, Dave, the Ford government did take its foot off the gas when it came to housing at the latter half of that second mandate. I believe they were concerned about making sure municipal leaders were on side. They didn't want to force it upon them. But in so doing, we're way behind the target, which means that, more young families are going to have to spend longer living with mom and dad in the basement than getting a great place to call their own. Here's why I'm an optimist, though. Number one, I think people are going to demand it. Number two, with our export industries in a state of uncertainty for who knows how long around the tariff battle, housing has the option to be that lifeline for our economy to keep our head above water. But the government needs to be aggressive and get the foot back on the gas. Third and finally, this is a real opportunity for Minister Flack to get things done and make them art. I'm a fan of his. So between us hanging out here on the ledge, I try to recruit him to run for me. He was wise enough to wait for Ford and got elected, but he was a really good advisor, smart business leader in the agribusiness. And he has, I think, a lot of potential to be a real game changer on housing. I rate this legislation as being an 8.5 out of 10. I think it was really interesting. They had Steve Del Duca, the former Liberal leader, there at the podium with them. Carolyn Parrish, mayor of Mississauga, who's not always been friendly to the Conservatives in the past. I think it shows a very good sign they may have the municipalities lined up for some legislation that will actually get homes built and put the foot back on the gas.
Yeah, but having said that, John, there isn't a mayor in the Greater Toronto area or the Golden Horseshoe area who wouldn't be cheering for any of this. So again, I want to come back to, I appreciate the optimism, and Tim is the resident optimist here. But at this stage, what's different in terms of how we're going to execute this plan to get it done?
Well, I sense an up tempo when you combine the province's outlook on this and the federal government. There is a sense behind the scenes, and clearly they're talking to each other, and that is the whole idea of let's just get shit done. There is a view, I think, that assessments and regulations have got in the way of a lot of what should be done. We're still talking about the Ring of Fire, many years after there was an idea to get things done there. And notwithstanding the fact that there are Indigenous and especially environmental groups under which Bill 5 will certainly affect endangered species and others, but there just seems to be an up-tempo to move forward and cut regulations. Now, of course, Donald Trump's doing that in the United States. And I'm not saying that they're mimicking it here, but you just get a sense that things are going to have to move forward on a variety of different fronts to minimize the approval process. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad at the moment. I don't think the public is completely tuned into it, but it certainly seems that is the Carney approach to things. Let's get shovels in the ground, let's get moving, and it may be echoed across the country in different provinces, but I think that's what's happening here.
Yeah, Keith, we're going to get to the comments about shovels in the ground and big transformational infrastructure. The Premier met with Premier Canoe this week. I want to get to that presently. But, you have often talked about, I keep coming back to this housing strategy as if it was the high-speed rail story. It's that kind of thing that, holy cow. Either we're doing it or we're not. So, and again, we'll give them some runway. But what do you see that's different?
Well, that was the big question for me. It's different, I think, to have a minister come out and say it's unaffordable to build housing in Ontario. That's almost an admission of defeat right off the bat. Well, then if it's unaffordable to build housing, maybe we need to look at some government-built housing like the wartime housing post-World War II. What I don't understand, and Tim probably has a much better understanding of how this will change things, but moving the development fees or charges from the beginning of the process before they, put the shovels in the ground to occupancy. I'm not clear how that's going to, because it didn't talk about bringing the development fees down. It just talked about moving to a different part of the process. That, I guess, will speed things up at the start, but I'm not sure how it's going to bring down the cost of housing or the development charges. The other thing I was interested to see was that we now have two ministers that are able to issue ministerial zoning orders to speed up properties. That's the thing that got them into trouble with the Greenbelt. Was the ministerial zoning orders. Now you're going to have two ministers doing it. Clearly, they're not worried about the blowback on the whole Greenbelt thing. They're trying to make action to get as many houses built as they can, and I think they see MZOs as the quickest way to do it if there's anything in the way that they don't like. They're also adding in, that the provincial building code trumps all. Municipalities can't bring in any new things, whether they're green initiatives or whatever else they want to do, restricting housing or rental. They can't do that. The provincial building code is going to apply. But I didn't see them say, and that means fourplexes are allowed everywhere. So I'm not sure how these changes are as dramatic as the government is saying. But to Tim's point, they did bring in the municipal leaders. They seem to have consulted all the locals as to what would be the best approach. So there's probably a better understanding from that level of this policy. But I don't see how it's going to bring down the price of houses. I just don't.
Tim, address the development charges, because it again, moving them to, I can see in terms of cash flow or commitment in terms of the development and all those sorts of things, I can see where there's some value in that. But the fact of the matter is, I want to move into that house and make sure that there's a sewer in the neighborhood, right? And a sidewalk. So we're gonna have to pay for it at some point. We're gonna have to deal with it there. So where in the equation does that, fit better, or does it help the process?
Yeah, it'll come back to water and sewer because it's a really important thing to discuss, in this government's approach. So what it basically does when it comes to development charges, it helps to de-risk it, right? So you're not going to be impacted by inflation or any changes along the way. Because housing development charge inflation can be quite sharp, actually deferring that is going to give you savings in the long run on that particular property. And you're actually going to have people living in the homes or in the condos to help pay those bills. So I think it just gives them a foundation of less risk, more stability and predictability when investing in housing in the province of Ontario, and other provinces do it this way. Let me get back to, I think, a really important and often overlooked point. And the government is talking about a new funding model for water and wastewater, which was actually part of what we did in the Affordable Housing Task Force. And we called for when I was CEO at AREA. And basically, when we finance our natural gas, we finance our electricity expansion, we do it across the entire rate base. People pay for it over time. Water and sewer is an upfront cost the first time home buyer, the first buyer of that home, has to pay for. And that can be anywhere from $50,000 to $80,000 off the top. They're proposing a new way to treat that like a utility. So users would pay over time, and the first, second, third, fourth user of that home that's using infrastructure would pay those costs. So if they go down that path, you could look at taking off the price of a home, 50 to 80K, right off the top for a new home.
Yeah, I like that idea. And as much as, make the entire community benefit from the development of this new housing development. And I think that,
who's building the
sense.
infrastructure? Who's paying to build is the province under that wastewater plan going to pay to build the infrastructure up front and then have it as a utility paid off forever, the life of the home?
Yeah, it would be financed, over time, because you've got that dependable rate coming in. So again, when we
who would have to do the financing? The local municipality?
It looks like they're going to my understanding, Keith's going to set up boards like we have for local distribution companies in energy, right? So our local LDCs will add on new hydro, a new factory comes in, a new neighborhood, and then is paid for over the rate base over 20 or 30 years. They're looking at a similar model. They'll consult with municipalities, businesses, ratepayer groups. But I'm a strong supporter of this. We do it in some parts of Ontario and other provinces, and it really means you reduce the upfront costs for a new home, get them on the market, and sensibly pay for it over time because it's worked for natural gas and it's worked for hydro.
Yeah, John, it provides some level of stability and long-term stability in terms of the cost of housing.
It does, but I wondered if I could address something a little bit different, and that is, the Bank of Canada had their meeting just recently, and one of the key factors on it was they're concerned that sticker shock with respect to mortgages is going to happen, and that there's going to be some financial strain on a lot of individuals and potentially financial institutions across the country. I was talking with my older boy yesterday, who's in his 30s and is a carpenter and doing quite well, but he's always wanted to live up in the northern part of the province, and said that he was noticing that there were even people who had had a property that was selling for about $799 that in fact had dropped very significantly down to about $400,000 and was basically a fire sale. I don't know what the instability is going to be going forward, but there's two factors to keep in mind. At the end of the day, it's not just about buying, it's about owning. It's about being able to come forward with the right amount of down payment. It's the one about having to make sure that there are interest rates in place so that you can actually qualify and get that home. And again, to the Bank of Canada, we may be looking at another cut in June. We may be looking at another one in September. But at the end of the day, it's about, the affordability of putting that down payment down. The affordability of being able to maintain it, and the affordability of being able to make those payments on the mortgage that you have. I think it'll be fascinating, maybe not the right word, but fascinating to watch over the next 4 to 6 months in terms of how the mortgage interest rate and the changes between what people got during COVID and what they're now going to experience actually affects the marketplace. So a different way of looking at it, but I think it's really important to try and understand that.
I want to look long term, and I think if you're looking at housing markets, et cetera, whether it's building or just people downsizing, upsizing, whatever it might be, Tim, to what level are you concerned when you see the condo market, particularly in large urban centers? You're starting to see a real softness in that area, and it's harder and harder to sell. Anecdotally, I know young couples who are having a hell of a time selling their 700 square foot condo in downtown Toronto.
Oh yeah, for sure. Look, I mean, it's good for buyers, but it's not good if that's your investment, a second income or your retirement plan. There's no doubt. It was overbuilt. There was this kind of exuberance to build all these condos. You have to plan them so far ahead, get the approvals that if the economy goes sideways, it's pretty hard to slam the brakes. So they are, how would I phrase this exactly? Anyway, they're going to be in a down market for some time. At the end of the day, because nothing new is going through the pipeline, probably in a couple of years, you're going to see a renaissance on the condo side as builders adjust. But right now, yeah, it's pretty tough.
I want to come back to the building and the new housing development. And part of this challenge, Keith, is not so much, all of the intricacies of the infrastructure or the actual, permits and all that sort of thing. It's actually trying to find the labor to do it one way or the other. There's problems with the apprenticeship programs. I read recently where, and it might have been the guys at ResCon, Richard Lyle and his team, they were commenting on the real challenge is finding the lower skilled labor, like to have somebody go into the labor market who is willing to swing a hammer or cut a piece of lumber. And it's harder and harder to find those workers because we have, our immigration system has set up to have more highly skilled labor. So we have this imbalance, and we're seeing it in some of these situations with the construction.
I don't understand it. When we see so many people struggling with these crazy gig economy jobs, trying to, 2 or 3 of them trying to get by and they're getting, dollars, $2, $3, $4 an hour if they're lucky. Why aren't they being used as you say, the lower skilled labor that on construction sites? There absolutely is a huge demand, and it's a problem right across the country apparently. So we do need more laborers, and the immigration system. That's a whole different thing. And apparently Mark Carney is going to keep to the numbers that Trudeau had. So there's still going to be an awful lot of them coming in. But are they all going to be the high skilled ones? Or are going to be some? I don't know. I don't know enough about that immigration program other than to know it's been a major target from the Conservatives of the federal Liberals. To Tim's point about the condo market being overbuilt, I saw yesterday there were 29,000 condos built in the GTA last year that came online last year. I mean, I don't know who thought there was going to be that many, especially when so many of them are not even 700 square feet. Dave, they're 500 square foot shoeboxes in the sky. And anybody with more than 2 people, if you're more than a couple, you just can't live in these things. And most of them are too big for 2 people. They're like a single person's hotel room almost. Some of them, they're that small. There's no oven. You get a little microwave. I mean, it's just they built them so small. They're just not what the market needs. The market needs small family homes. And that's the big issue right now. But as to the labor issue, that's something that the feds and the provinces have to coordinate. Quebec seems to be getting more homes built than Ontario. And I don't know if that's because they're better selecting their immigrants than Ontario is or not.
Well, John, the whole issue around the condo point that Keith just made, part of that too is that these are condominiums that are in downtown Toronto, and there was a day when that would have been fine. My son and daughter-in-law lived in one, and it was walkable. They could walk to the restaurant, they could walk to work, they could do all of those things. Now, post-COVID, they work out of their home. Doesn't matter. I mean, so that has created, I think, accelerated the crunch in terms of how valuable that place is, because they don't want to be working on top of each other in those places either.
Well, I think so, but it takes me back to what I was alluding to when I talked about my eldest son. I mean, we're at a very macro level when we're discussing this stuff. We're not talking about what's fueling the great anger and concern amongst young people to get a foot in the door, to own something. I mean, you're looking now at people who are going to be 35 or 40 years of age before they can even get into the housing market, or they're going to resign themselves to saying that I'm going to rent for the rest of my life, and that's the way it's going to go. At the same hand, you've got all these condos which are basically shoebox vacant. And I don't, if you take a look at the last federal election campaign, a lot of those people were over with the Conservatives. They weren't with the federal government. I mean, I would nickname the Conservatives as being kind of the grievance party, but it's absolutely true. They were being fueled by young people who can't get a leg up and can't own a house, and are living in conditions which they desperately want to get out of and want to do something about. So I understand how we're addressing it at the macro level, but we're not addressing the human issue down at that level of not only having the abundance of being able to get a home, but we're talking about creating homes which are still going to be out of reach, and the ability to get a loan from the bank or from any other financial institution still out of reach. So there's a growing discontent among a really key group of people. And I don't see any relief at the moment. And maybe, the new housing minister federally can do something about it. Maybe the provincial governments can, but I don't see a path forward on that. The second thing is that as we break down the barriers of interprovincial trade, you can see that we're also breaking down barriers in terms of labor mobility. So to Keith's point, I mean, we may be getting, some people who want to do carpentry work in the province of Ontario, but decide, I'm going to go to Alberta. Alberta, remember the advertising campaign where they came into Ontario and they were saying, come out to Alberta, earn more, own your home, and all that sort of stuff. There's a different marketplace developing. It's not just bringing in the right immigrants with the right skill sets, but it's also in terms of, having that mobility to go wherever you choose, whether you're a carpenter, whether you're a nurse, whether you're someone else in a profession. And if the accreditation issues can be solved, then we're stuck with another issue, and that is jurisdictions competing for all the skilled labor that we have and that we need. So I see this macro thing that we're all talking about here. I see it through the lens of my 33-year-old son who's married and is renting. And I see it through his lens, and I don't know how any of this is going to help them, move forward in their lives to own anything. I don't think they would even come into Toronto and try and own something that was a shoebox, as you say. I mean, I've been to some of these condos that are incredibly small. I don't know. There's not even closets in some of them. So I'm open to hearing about what we can do for those young people. And when we say young people, they're not 19 and 20. They're in their 30s and later 30s who've always wanted to buy a house, and they just can't access it whatsoever.
Imagine being in your 30s and realizing you need $100,000 a down payment to get one of those 500 square foot condos, or probably $200,000 if you actually want a house where you could raise one or two children in. Who in your 30s can imagine saving in a bank $200,000 or $150,000? That's just out of reach for most working people. I don't care what kind of really good big city income you're making. Saving that kind of money is near impossible for most people, unless it's generational family wealth being helped out, which helps some people, not the majority. So I don't know how governments can get around helping young people with down payments. I don't know what can be done, but when they're that high, lowering the price of a house, even with the development charge, Tim says, it can bring it down maybe $60,000 to $80,000. The down payments are still going to be at least $100,000. And I don't know how young people can even conceive. That's why most of them just determined to be renters until they maybe later in life will move to a smaller community where they can afford a home or something like that. But buying in the city, I think, in most of the major GTA communities is out of touch for an awful lot of people.
So supply of housing is one issue, and I know you've been banging that drum for a long time, Tim, in terms of, that's key component in terms of making housing more affordable. But that's a longer play. And the stuff that, John has mentioned, that Keith has mentioned, I'm seeing it play out. There's friends of ours who, again, young couple, their kids living at a condo in North York. It's about 1,100 square feet, so it's not really a small one. But they're renting it. They're trying to find a place in Toronto, can't. So they've just picked up and moved to Ottawa. They found, they're looking for an affordable house in Ottawa. So how do we cut through that affordability veil? Because that's the real obstacle now, isn't it?
We detected that when I was at AREA too. We actually followed where people were searching for homes, and you saw the people you mentioned, Dave, looking at New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. The big winner was Alberta. by the way, to your point earlier and Keith's point, well, Quebec is outpacing Ontario. Alberta is actually building a lot of homes right now. So, why can they do it and we can't? But let me end my comments here on a more positive note, because I actually do believe this is going to turn on politically. As John characterized, there is this massive generation of people who are going to put pressure, continued pressure on elected leaders to get something done, and their moms and dads who love them dearly, but want them out of the house and seeing them move forward on their own. So I think that is irresistible pressure. Currently, Trump and tariffs have our focus, but this is going to rise up again. Reason for optimism number two, we talked about Minister Flack's legislation. Mark Carney did have some pro-housing and pro-ownership initiatives in his electoral plan. So let's see if he moves forward with it. A couple of examples, on where he could do better. He's talked about GST relief on new homes, but only for first-time buyers. That should be broadened to any buyer. Why do I say that? Because there could be a young couple that own a home. They want to move up now that the kids have come along. And if they had that tax break, the starter home would become available to somebody else. So a more powerful instrument would make that GST relief welcome, broad. He's also talked about reducing development charges to municipalities by up to 50% and compensating those municipalities with federal dollars so they can still build the bridge of the road. However, Dave, he's limiting that to multi-unit homes only, apartments, fourplexes, et cetera. Again, welcome, but you should do that for all homes. I do believe it's time for the Marshall Plan equivalent around housing to satisfy the political demand to help our economy. Elements are on the table. They just need to press that gas and get going down the highway a little bit faster. And there's a couple ideas on how to do it.
Okay, so all of this around affordability, and as I mentioned off the top, we're talking on Thursday morning. The budget's going to land in about 6 hours, whatever it might be. And not to tell tales out of school, but you probably got all the documents in front of you, Keith, but you're just being a good boy and you're not breaking the embargo. So thanks for that.
Remember, the finance minister watches the show, so
Yes,
I'll be looking for that.
I haven't even opened the files. Haven't opened
anything. That's it. So we're going blind here. The premier, making it pretty clear, and I don't think this is unusual. The 10 days before the budget gets dropped, we see all these terrific announcements. And the premier was out in Durham this week and making, several announcements, but not the least of which he started with these comments.
Since day one, our government has been focused on putting more money back into the pockets of the families right here in Durham region and across the hard-working taxpayers of Ontario. It's simple. We believe that taxpayer money belongs to the taxpayers, not to the government, and so every chance we get, we're giving taxpayers back more of what's theirs.
Back more of what's theirs. And so, and he ran down a whole long list of all of the initiatives that the Ford government has taken lately to make sure that you have more money in your pocket, and then took the opportunity to talk about the gas tax and 407 tolls.
But now, in the face of President Trump's tariffs, which are rising the cost of everyday essentials, we need to do even more. So today, I'm announcing that as part of our upcoming budget, our government will be making our temporary cuts to gas and fuel tax rates permanent. Saving households on an average of about $115 per year going forward. That builds on the $1.7 billion our government has saved families since the temporary gas and fuel tax cuts were first introduced in July of 2022. And we're not stopping there. We're here next to the 407 East in Durham, which is the largest stretch of provincially owned tolled highway in Ontario. Today, I'm pleased to announce that starting June the 1st, 2025, tolls from Brock Road to Highway 35, 115 are coming off the 407. Okay.
And when we look at that, and we know that going into this, we're going to expect a whole lot more spending in this because, as the premier pointed out, the Trump tariffs are still a threat, the instability of the economy, all the question marks around it, et cetera. So on top of all of the spending that we're going to get today, Keith, that, in fact, we just heard what sounds to me. I realize it's a tax cut, but it's a spending announcement. If you actually look at it, it's costing us money in the long run in terms of how the government's going to do its business.
It's absolutely costing the government revenue, but it's one of the easiest affordability issues that the government can address. I mean, they know the bigger issue is, and Premier Ford even discussed it this week. He said he hasn't given up on the idea of trying to buy back the 407, the entire thing. But he admitted it's tens of billions of dollars, and he's worried it's going to be over capacity within 10 years. But this idea of, you'll have to forgive me, I thought the gas tax freeze had been made permanent already. But I'm not surprised, so it's been here 4 years. So this year he's saying, okay, it's now going to be permanent. These affordability issues, I mean, the gas tax and those tolls, if you happen to take those stretches of highway on any sort of a regular basis, that adds up very quickly. Having those tolls eliminated is a huge deal and a big relief for people. It's the kind of cost of living thing that people want to see from their governments. So I think in this budget, Ford's made it pretty clear. They're going to be spending. They're going to be spending a lot. They're not going to be hiking taxes. So that means they're not going to be balancing the budget either. They're going to be willing to run a deficit for a couple of years longer than they'd originally planned to make the spending to deal with the Trump tariffs, the threats from those. And I'm sure they've been coordinating with the federal government as to, that they're both going to spend in the right areas, the infrastructure they need, and the support for the labor group, that the people that are going to be affected most, the workers are going to be affected most by the Trump tariffs. I assume the feds and the provinces have been coordinating, and I think we'll see some action in the provincial budget that will, be mirrored or echoed with the federal. Well, there won't be a federal budget, but the federal Ways and Means motion that comes along. I think we're seeing some coordinated efforts there, and I expect that, the spending that we see from Ford, from the Ontario government to help people affected by the tariffs will be similar or buttressed by the federal Ways and Means motion when it comes in.
Yeah, it's down in the weeds, wonkishness, Tim, when we start to talk about the Ways and Means, motion in Ottawa versus a budget, et cetera. But the underlying issue there is the message from the federal government is we're not really quite sure what the immediate horizon looks like in terms of how we can put, numbers in whatever spreadsheet. But the government at Queen's Park is doing that, although the premier day or so ago said, holy cow, with everything that's going on, and we'll get into the Honda situation, but there is uncertainty even in the budgeting. So how useful, in capitals and italics and bold, is this particular budget document in terms of where Ontario is going to be a year from now? If there's that level of uncertainty around, what the economy is going to look like, what jobs are going to look like, whatever.
Typically when a government is on its third term, and that's pretty rare as it is, it starts to lose gas. It gets complacent. It's at risk of, corruption or being out of touch. And I don't see that at this point with the Ford government, and this discipline of the threat of Trump tariffs and the potential of losing 500,000 high quality manufacturing jobs has really given them religion. I'm really torn on this, right? Like, I want us to get through this. I remain confident that we will hit, flat track on this roller coaster with Trump. There'll be tariffs, but I think Canada can get a better deal and improve, our competitive advantage versus other countries. But here's the flip side. I hope we get off this ride, but the flip side is that is actually putting pressure on governments, provincial and national, to address those long-standing issues that nobody's had the courage to confront. So I do hope there's still that pressure. And to your question, Dave, I think this is going to be less about spending or tax relief, although elements. It's going to be more so about the big issues and getting them solved. Interprovincial trade barriers. There's been more progress on that. Hope they carry through than there's been in my 3 decades, right? Being part of or following public life, investing in transportation infrastructure, tapping into the critical minerals in Northern Ontario, speeding up the approval process, doubling down on nuclear, making us an energy superpower that can export. These are all very exciting things that nobody has really pushed hard enough for so long at a national level. I'll keep this sort of stuff embargoed as well, like Keith, but I was in the Premier's office this past week. We talked transportation. He told me a few things coming down the pike that I'm very excited about. And he spoke highly of Mark Carney and the relationship they've had as a sort of a businessman, and being serious, being humbly described him as. Similarly, getting pipelines built, strengthening our defense, and making sure you don't have federal and provincial rules clashing that grinds everything to a halt. I've rambled a bit here, but I actually think this pressure means we will move things forward in a structural way I just hope they keep going and don't lose their courage.
Well, and let's go back to the Carney thing, because I think to your point, Tim, and you weren't rambling. There isn't a simple answer here. I think is really the point. And the Prime Minister sat down with Vashi Kapelas this week and talked about all of those things, and that whole notion, John, of Canada being a superpower in energy and development and et cetera. She was pressing him on that around pipelines, et cetera, as she should have. And to Tim's point, kind of took a step back when he answered.
If you want a simple answer on will I support building a pipeline? Yes, that simple answer, given that multiple times. But I don't stop at that. I don't stop it. For example, if you want a simple answer on how do I make homes more affordable, I could just say, we're going to cut GST on homes. But that doesn't solve the problem. Just doing one pipe, it's good. Don't get me wrong, it's good. That's a positive thing, and working collaboratively in order to happen. But it's not enough. It's not enough to make Canada an energy superpower. It's not enough to build our full potential. It's not enough to truly get incomes growing across the country. We can do much more. We are going to be very, very ambitious. Build big, build bold, build now.
So all of those things, John, walk and chew gum at the same time is kind of the meme here, but he's kind of right. There isn't a simple answer, and we can't be looking for simple answers. We're going to have to be brave and courageous to do the right thing, and it might be messy and painful.
Well, and he'll have to start in his own cabinet when his new cultural identity minister steps out of, into his first role and says, "Oh, there's no pipeline going through my province." It's like, it does require a lot of stakeholder consultation, and you can't just kind of say, well, we're going to wave the magic wand and everything's going to get done very, very quickly. I think, let me comment first on the federal scene and then go to the provincial scene. I still think, as I said last week and the week before, we're still getting to know this prime minister and how he's going to go about governing the country. I'm not sure I've got a signal yet on the cabinet. I'm looking at the priorities. He had that first press conference where he laid out what he was intending to do in a very crisp way, said that we're going to get shovels in the ground, we're going to get tax reductions done, we're going to get moving forward. Well, it's a big ship. It takes a little while for it to move into position and start to go forward. We're not going to, as far as we know now, get a federal budget. Some people will argue that gives a sense of spending plans. Others will say, well, we don't really need it. We just need an update. But the reality is that we're still getting to know what the nature and scope of this government is. Number two, he made a lot of points during that interview about consultation. I mean, he's very careful in what he does say. For a guy that's never been in politics, he certainly has the language down. But what he's talking about here is making sure that he has a cooperation with everybody, which includes Premier Ford, and making sure that there are signals being sent to the provincial governments in terms of how we're going to move forward on these files. All of it against the backdrop of the trade agreement that we're going to have with the United States, the impact which is now coming to us. I mean, we're now getting notice that grocery stores are running out of runway in terms of all the stuff that they bought beforehand, and we're now going to get increased prices on a lot of those goods, all against the backdrop of trying to smack down interprovincial trade barriers and move people in a particular direction. The reality is it's going to take time. And a budget that the provincial government has here is only going to solve part of this issue. It really is going to be a federal jurisdictional issue to make sure that those pieces are put in place so that it provides momentum, not just for each of the provinces, but for the country. And I don't see yet that blueprint of where we're going. We're just gleaning it off of the odd interview that the prime minister is giving, trying to read the tea leaves in terms of some of the key ministers that we saw appointed to the cabinet. But then even seeing the differences amongst the cabinet members who he's going to have to deal with, who have different views in terms of where his own government seems to be going. So I think the pieces are still in motion. I don't think we've got an answer yet as to what the plan is.
And I think that's fair, Keith. I mean, just where we are. But here's what the direction, or the sense of direction I'm getting from this is, and it came out in the meeting with Doug Ford and Wab Kinew this week, is that it's not just going to land on the federal table. It's not just going to be about the feds making decisions about it. And we talked last week about the need for the provinces, and Doug Ford particularly, he was taking the initiative in terms of getting these MOUs on interprovincial trade barriers coming down, signing them with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and he's lined up others, and then this week talk to Manitoba. So I think that is part of this, and we're very impatient when it comes to that. But I'll give him credit. Both he and, here you're talking about the conservative who acts like a liberal and the NDP who acts like a conservative, all in the same room. They're finding common ground when they made this announcement.
Think of this. These are big numbers. Our two provinces already do approximately $19.5 billion of interprovincial trade every single year. But we can do better. As neighbors and partners within Canada, Ontario and Manitoba can lead the way by creating new opportunities for goods, services, and workers to move freely between our provinces. And that's what today's agreement will do to help all of us.
We're knocking down trade barriers, and we're building up Team Canada. Ontario, Manitoba, and everybody coming to the table. It's a great thing to see. We know that our country has been threatened, and it's been inspiring to see Canadians respond to these risks presented to our economy by saying, you know what, we want to take advantage of this opportunity and build Canada up to be even stronger, to have even more jobs, to have even more money being put into the wallets and the bank accounts of people right across this great land. And so I think we got a real window right now to do the big nation-building projects that have just been ideas for the past number of years. Now we can get shovels in the ground.
So it's a cheerleading it's not just cheerleading on the sidelines here, Keith. This is real action. And I appreciate John's point in terms of this is going to take time, but a lot has happened on this file in the last 6 weeks.
They're doing, Doug Ford in particular, but with the other provinces and territories, is doing a lot of the legwork that Mark Carney needs to have done, especially if he wants to keep that July 1st deadline he set for himself of having the interprovincial trade barriers as eliminated as they can be for the first go-round. It's been fascinating to watch. Doug Ford, of course, he wanted to make Ontario the leader in this, but it's exactly the kind of thing. That speech there by Premier Canoe, that's exactly the kind of thing I think Canadians just, sit back and smile at when they see their politicians talking about coming together. As you say, the Democratic government, like liberal, the conservative, the political stripes don't matter. They come at this from what does Canada need. And, the smile, the strength behind it all, it's like, this is what we need to do. We need to do it now. We need to do it together. That's exactly what Canadians are looking to see. I find it interesting when Prime Minister Carney talks about, okay, I'll build the pipelines. But at the same time, I'm also going to keep putting funding into carbon capture because I think this is actually going to work. We need to do both. We need to use more of our resources, but also keep pushing on our environmental protections to deal with climate change. So I think that's going to be a real battle for the government going forward. But watching the provinces get together and the territories and laying, as I say, a lot of the hard groundwork for Mark Carney is going to make it easier for him to just basically have to deal with the federal regulations that cause problems in interprovincial trade and get them out of the way while the provinces and territories are coming up with these MOUs on themselves. It's a great ground game at this point, and it seems to be tackling all the hard issues that, as Tim pointed out, for his 3 decades around the politics, people have talked about these things. And to your point, Dave, very much like high-speed rail, we're going to study it again. It never, ever comes together. But this time, the impetus is actually here. And of course, the good thing is, while we're doing all this, we see Donald Trump actually making deals with China, with the UK, with other countries. And he's talking with the EU now. Canada's going to get a deal that's going to bring the tariffs down to a manageable rate, I hope, at this point. So it's all coming together as it should. But to watch Canadians come together, to watch your provinces and territories come together and not really, yes, there's some bickering. And as Premier Ford said, Danielle and I do get along. Of course, they're going to have some differences of opinion, but they do all, I think, have Canada first in their minds. And I think that's exactly what Canadians are looking for their politicians right now at all levels. So to see all levels of government cooperating like that, it brings out pride. It absolutely does.
So how much three-dimensional chess is going on here, Tim, vis-a-vis the trade conversation south of the border with Canada? And I say that because I would think that the strongest negotiating leverage that the federal government would have is to have 13 first ministers standing behind him saying, we're all in the same boat here. We're all pulling on the same oars. We're all pulling in the same direction. And even if that means, all the other provinces and territories having to stand up for Alberta, as Premier Smith said a couple of days ago, make sure that they come first. that we can salve some of that, salve some of that issue internally, that really makes it stronger in terms of how we're going to present internationally.
So I think no 3D chess. I don't think it's chess. I think it's more like Pop-O-Matic trouble, right? You sort of see what you get. You move your piece, or you go back home, or whatever. So I want to add one more piece on the Interprovincial, and it is great to see Ford now inking these deals and it cause momentum for others. I do think that the Prime Minister has a role here to play to reward good behavior, and then sort of sticks to go along with the carrots if they don't. Like, by way of example, when I spoke with people in the agriculture sector, there's something wrong with Ontario potatoes. They seem fine to me and my family, but Prince Edward Island would not let a single spud come into their province, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then Newfoundland has this crazy rule where any beer brought into the province has to be either bottled or packaged in Newfoundland. And, this is the time now to build on momentum, reward good behavior, infrastructure funds, for example, but call out the ridiculous. Okay, on Trump and Tariff, I phrase this sort of the arrogance of small differences. I think sometimes as Canadians, we think we're a bigger deal and want to accentuate differences with Americans to make us feel better about ourselves. And like as much as it dominates our news and is very relevant to talk about today, we're not on the radar screen in the same way in the States. And bigger things like China, President Trump's trip to the Middle East, Ukraine, Russia, deal with the UK. So I think it's very much reactive. I think it's very much relationship based, and an ability for the president of the day to say he got a win for his country. I remain the optimist that have been since day one. I think we can get inside the tariff wall. Maybe there'll be a base rate of tariffs, so we'll get a better deal than everybody else. But your question, Dave, no, I don't think it's chess at all. I think it's gut. I think it's reaction and what's in front of the president on any given day.
Before we go, I want to get to two other things, and John, just the one of the sort of the disturbance in the force this week was the announcement from Honda about pausing all of their EV manufacturing plants, and they're not saying no, and they struck the right tone and said it's not going to affect anything that's going on in Alliston, etc. But boy, that's a flaming arrow that we can't ignore.
Well, there's two things about that, and I'm glad you brought it up, because again, we're really talking at a very macro level with all of this. And what's going to hit home in the next short period of time is going to be disruptions with the automotive manufacturers, but also with just manufacturers as well. We have a 7.8% unemployment rate in this province. And if it weren't for the election and the hiring of all of those people that helped run the election, we would be in an even worse situation. So I don't want to be a negative Nelly and all of this sort of stuff, but there's a reality that's going to have to be that will be reflected in this budget that I'll be very, welcome to come back and take a look at next week when we see what the plan's going to be. But, it would be like anybody else if the federal government on both sides in Canada and the United States had said, look, by a certain period of time, you're going to have 35% of the vehicles made in each of the countries or sold in these countries are going to have to be EV based. Well, there you go. You've got all kinds of battery plants that have come to Canada. They've pivoted to position themselves properly so they can sell into the United States, and they've got a market that they can deal with. Here comes a new president who says, nope, not going to do that. Goodbye. So it's almost like overnight. It's not just the tariffs. It's the entire approach to what the market looks like and how it's being affected. So this is not going to go away. This is not kind of a hold and wait situation. There's a major restructuring going on in the economy south of us. There's a major restructuring of the economy here in this country, undergoing immense regulatory change and trying to catch up to make sure that we're not affected entirely by the United States. But there's a short-term issue. We can talk all we want about the bringing down of interprovincial trade balances, and my goodness, when is the LCBO going to actually put all the liquor back on the shelf so that Canadians who now can make the choices and are making the choices with their own buying power can start making the choices there? This is going to be the critical thing. The government of the day in the province of Ontario, the new polling shows that they're sitting at 46%, the Liberals at 36%. I think the NDP down about 14%. That's a bounce change that's been picked up from the federal election campaign. But nonetheless, the Ford government has a lot of political capital at the moment to work with. This is a third term. Each one of those elections was 40% or above. and they can make some long-term changes with the federal government, the provincial government. But the short-term investment is going to be really critical. And that's what I'm going to be looking for in the budget when it comes out. What is a short-term benefit to these people who are going to be laid off? They've said, the government has said, we're with you all the way anyway. That, in fact, will spell it out in the budget in terms of how we're going to look after people in the short term, but also how we're going to set up for that longer term.
Tim, the premier was asked about this, obviously, earlier in the week when it happened, and they asked about the status of the incentive funding that both the feds and the province had put out in front of Honda, and the premier's answer, paraphrasing, was essentially, "We're going to hold them accountable." How do they do that? How do they hold Honda accountable to make sure that that whatever investment that the government has promised or subsidy or whatever it might be is honored?
I don't think it can do much. I've got to believe that in any kind of agreement for money to flow, something must have happened, right? They must make good. So you can hold them accountable for any pieces, whether that's machinery, early jobs, moving. But I suspect money doesn't flow until they actually start producing, I would hope. And the reality is that, electric cars are not selling at the rate that people had hoped that they would do. Trump has reversed the Biden EV mandate, and moving through Congress today is an actual move that has momentum. It's passed in the House. We'll see what happens in the Senate, to revoke the unique ability of California to have their own EV mandate. Right? It's the biggest purchase of automobiles. That's significant. I think there are 11 or 12 other states that have the California standard. So that looks like it's going to disappear too, by the way, with some Democrat support. So I think that the sector is obviously slowing down. I think the sector may have had a bit of overzealousness in policy. You need to find ways, Dave. I think the approach is, how will you actually stimulate more purchases and demand? Do more on the tax credits? Do they improve the quality? More charging stations, longer lasting batteries? But this is going to be installed for a while, and I think you have to be realistic about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the infrastructure issue is primary. I mean, Keith, who's surprised to say, well, people aren't flocking to buy electric vehicles when you have no place to plug them in along the 401? So I think that's an obvious thing that's missing from this conversation.
Absolutely. Try it in Nova Scotia. Try it in New Brunswick.
Yeah.
I mean, people actively want cars, and I've seen people who do, and I know people who do own electric cars, and everyone will go over, okay, can you get to the airport? Well, no, I usually stop in Truro and charge on the way. Well, people don't want to, even if it's a quick charge. People don't want to do that. The range isn't there, and there's only like 3 charging stations in the next 150, 200 kilometers between our place and the airport. That's insane. And at those charging stations, they're like maybe 2 vehicles can be charged. There's no, big lot of 8 or 10 charging stations. The infrastructure is nowhere near being there, and mandating that people, the way the opposition was putting it, that our gas-powered vehicles would be outlawed by 2035. Well, that's not exactly what people want to hear. I currently am driving a 12-year-old car, and I plan on driving it for another many years. I would like an EV, but there's just no infrastructure there to support it. I think the hybrids have a market. I think the governments, though, the provincial and even the federal governments, in ponying up for the battery plants that they want Honda to build and Volkswagen as well. I believe they're structured that no money flows till these buildings are built and jobs are started. I mean, it's a guarantee from the province. But if the projects are delayed, I think the money is delayed as well. I don't think the taxpayers are actually on the hook for the billions of dollars that were committed to these EV battery plants. And to Tim's point, the market has changed. I don't know if we're actually going to need those plants. But at least, Honda has said they're going to, it's not going to affect the current, I think it's 4,200 jobs at Alliston. That's good. But will those battery plants actually end up being built? Volkswagen seems to be going ahead with the big plan there, but I don't know if Honda's going to go that way, or are they going to decide that it's just going to be easy to build that battery plant in the United States?
And one quick
go ahead,
point.
Tim.
Yeah, just I want to reinforce Keith's good point. Hybrid should count. I had a hybrid before it got stolen, but then our next one, we actually got a hybrid again. We don't plug it in, but it does both gas electric, and I think that's practical, and we found it attractive. My main point was going to be, look, we're going to have to back away from our own EV mandates. There is a federal mandate on EVs. I think Prime Minister Carney should revisit that in light of the developments, because what it means if we have that mandate and the Americans don't, it's going to make Canada even less attractive for any kind of new investment or existing investment in auto production.
Well, it also complicates the issue in terms of just manufacturing, period. If we talk about a North American, market, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And yeah, I'm on team hybrid as well.
There you go.
But you know what though? At the end of the day, the hybrid has actually reduced my gas cost consumption by like a third or more. It's crazy. So anyway, that's where we go. Before we go, we would be remiss if we did not bring up the poor situation that Nate Erskine-Smith finds himself in this week. He feels disrespected. It's impossible not to feel disrespect after being dropped from cabinet. Now, he doubled down on an interview with CBC this week because at the end of the interview, he said all of the things he said to the media, but he said, well, now, I'll just have time to do a whole lot more things. I'll have my podcast and maybe I'll answer a couple of phone calls. But he completely, speaking of disrespect, disrespected his own constituents in Beaches, what is it, East York, I guess, completely diminishing the role or the relationship that he has with his constituency. I thought, holy crap. I don't know. I'll leave it to you. I know you were in his corner as the housing guy, so
I'll tell you what sort of happened, a little bit of what happened behind the scenes. But first, look, when I succeeded John Tory as leader of the Ontario PC Party, I was considering, well, I didn't form a cabinet. You do make important decisions about, who are the leads on the opposition benches, the key roles that they play, who, would qualify as a candidate, or who may be disqualified. And I actually looked at how people, treated John Tory when he was leader. Now, John and I are different shades of blue on the conservative spectrum, but as a leader, that mattered. And if you run out there and you look like you're selfish, you're not a team player, you undermine the cause, you ain't getting a front row seat on my team. So he's disqualified himself. So what happened behind the scenes, there actually was a cabal of us. I was part of the cabal on the housing side that did lobby to have Nate Erskine-Smith remain as housing minister. We had a good relationship, but most importantly, we would have had then 4 housing ministers nationally in a short period of time. We wanted continuity because of the urgency around housing. So I don't know, Hudak, beside the name of people endorsing him, jinxed him or whatever. There were a few people on the conservative side that wanted to see that continuity. But man, he's really, by doing this, narrow casting, his road ahead to being the soft rebel within caucus, as opposed to cabinet, future leadership, or getting a good gig, outside of Parliament.
Well, even the idea that, that they floated the idea of Sabrina and Angie at Queen's Park saying, well, really the long game is he wants Bonnie Crombie's job. Yeah. Who the hell would want him on the team or leading a team? John, I don't get it.
No, I think to Tim's point, I mean, if you're going to be in politics, you got to play the long game. And you don't come out and criticize your party when something like that happens, especially nowadays with social media. It was so blatant, glaring, and in your face. Sometimes there are sops that are given to people, an appointment somewhere, who knows? It could be an overseas post or something like that. But I think he's really limited his effectiveness in this government. Let me just end on my point here again. I think where the Ford government is going to make ground, and we saw it here with the announcements on the gas tax and on the tolls, the issue of affordability remains the most important issue in this province. And yes, you can look at it and say it's healthcare as at the top of the list, and then affordability, and then trade issues with the United States. That's the order of them and how we go into this circumstance of the budget. But the reality is that affordability, everything we've talked about today, whether it be about housing, whether it be about even the ability to buy a car, going out and finding out that they're $85,000, and I don't know how you buy a brand new car nowadays, and even go to the used marketplace. This is a critical dimension that the Ford government understands. So while they may be critics about handing back, money on license plates and a series of other things, it matters to people right now, and it's going to matter more in the next 6 months. So the budget today is going to lay out some of those key proponents of what it's going to be to support those people who are really in need. And I'm going to be looking for what that plan looks like, because it's not going to be short term. It's going to be for a longer haul as we move forward.
Well, Keith, it might be an affordability issue then for Nate Erskine-Smith, because he also took a pay cut. So
Well, he did take a pay cut, $99,000 pay cut, and you lose your car and driver. But I think he feared that Jamil Javani was getting too much ink.
Right.
Because it's like he must have known while doing it that this is pretty self-destructive behavior, and I'll just let it go with that.
All right. Well, let's leave it at that. And again, if you are listening on the radio to this program, you're only getting 42 minutes. We're well over an hour here, and there was all kinds of fun and games. And there isn't a minute that you don't want to miss. So Tim Hudak, Keith Leslie, John Wright, and we're missing Kathleen Wynne this week, but everybody will be back in the chair next week. Thanks to all, and I hope you all have a long holiday weekend. And again, making the point, make sure you follow us on Spotify and Apple and iHeart, or subscribe to the YouTube channel. And this show, and Now and Next, this week we had the cast in our comms and strategy team able to give their thoughts on everything from Pete Rose to, we had their thoughts on Nate Erskine-Smith as well. So just curious to see how that plays out. You'll want to subscribe to the YouTube channel. You get both shows. All right. Enjoy your long holiday weekend. I'm Dave Trafford. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario politics podcast.
I have a YouTube channel right here, as you can all people see. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content. Look at this. Bye now.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.